How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Before we get in, I'd really just like to mention I think we started this podcast last year, right after the conference. You inspired me at that was my first conference, that was my first keynote, and just listening to you, your words really stayed with me. And I was all kicked about starting this podcast. The intention of the podcast would be essentially to capture a little bit of your journey, certain aspects of it that I'd like to delve into more.
Okay, great. Super.
So you've already shared your motivation to have found Ross Barney Architects in 1981. Essentially, what you talk about, it was driven by a philosophical desire to build a better world, and practical issues was during a merger is what you spoke about when I did my homework on you. So additionally, you emphasized that relationships, not just products, are the key to success. So could you delve a little deeper into how this shaped your transition period, particularly how did you navigate finding work independently? A skill, again, I think you recognize as well that is not typically taught in architecture school.
Oh, yeah. And the thing about it is sometimes, like at the conference, you'll hear people being very critical about that. Oh, they don't teach you enough in architecture school. I'm not sure that those lessons can be taught in architecture school. I think some really important lessons can be taught in architecture school, but there's a lot that you have to learn when you are actually working, day by day in the profession. When I got out of school, I found out this isn't true anymore, but it's just an example. When I got out of school, I found out that when I was drawing for 8 hours a day, because we were physically drawing back in the Ice Age or the Stone Age or whichever one, we were physically drawing every drawing. And I found out that the speed that I could acquire after doing it 8 hours a day was amazing compared to school. School, you learn enough. And it's sometimes it's just doing things that's how you learn to do them. And I know it's still true because I watch my students. I teach fifth year at IIT, and I watch them as they acquire speed. And the speed's really important because then as soon as you can do these sort of mundane things, then you can really turn to idea making. And that I think that problem solving is what makes design a superpower, what makes it so important. But going back to your question about actually finding work, which is okay. I'm an architect. I want to do work. I have to find someone who will trust me with millions of their dollars. It's not like making a painting. You can make a painting and then say, "Oh, do you like it? Will you buy it?" But you really have to gain the trust of your clients. And the other thing that's really a corollary thought with that is that a piece of architecture is never really yours. I mean, I think about it as mine. I get very involved in the work I do, but it never is. It's always a community action. Design is, and a community piece. It's important that you stay in your lane because you can get in huge, gigantic messes by not structuring a design collaborative, including design with the owner. But finding work is still the most interesting. And I think I was pretty lucky because in the jobs that I had enough client contact that I sort of understood that it was that relationship that would get me work. And that if I didn't know the owner and if they didn't feel that they could talk to me, I had no chance. I mean, there's always this idea, especially among students or young architects, or maybe still architects, it's hopeful that they see your beautiful work and they'll hire you. And I don't know. I don't think that's ever happened to me. I don't think it's ever happened to me. It's really talking and understanding. And so you can teach that in school. And I think for when I'm teaching a studio, for example, I always like to have a client, a real client, someone outside of me, their critic, and their colleagues who's involved in the job. So usually what I'll try to do when I'm doing that is I'll I'll ask a client of mine to step in as a client, or if it is a real project, I'll see if I can have a contact. So it's that type of conversation and collaboration that leads to your next job. I think a shocking number for young architects sometimes is the amount of commissions that are repeat clients. I mean, for us, and we do all public work, so we have the sort of advantage or disadvantage that our public owners have to consider more than one client. They can't say, Carol, I really like you, but I'm going to give you that job. That doesn't happen in the public sector at all. So almost all of our jobs are individual selections, but they still rely on what they know about you, the relationship they've had in the past. So after I realized this, that's what I worked at. I tried to meet the people instead of trying to find the jobs that I wanted to do, which is, you'd look and say, oh, who's building a library? Usually by the time they've decided to do that, it's too late. They know who the architect will be. So what I did is I looked for the people who built what I wanted to do. So it was sort of the inverse of the process. And I'd spend a lot of time, using libraries as an example, finding out what districts were talking about. I mean, they do talk to each other. There's all kinds of organizations that are really helpful. If there's something that you love to do, get involved with the people who do it, because answering RFPs, you're too late. You may get that job, but you're too late. It's having people trust you and understanding what the challenges are for that building, for that community, for that type. And when you make that transition, I think you do a lot better. I think that the pitfall of that, though, is I never want to be so expert that that's the only type of work I get. I think that being an architect, making buildings, that's super specialized already. I get a little uncomfortable when owners say, well, I'm going to hire this architect because they've done 75 schools and I'm going to do a school, so they must be the best. Actually, schools are simple. They're buildings. What you want to do is find the best school, or you want to find ones that align with your objectives, not quantity. One of the jokes I think among architects is that QBS, qualification-based selection, which is for most public projects, that's the law of the land. In theory, they're not even supposed to ask you how much you will charge them to do that work before they select you. But the joke is it's not QBS qualifications, it's QBS quantity-based selection. But I think that not all people who specialize in building types do this, but I think it might make you too sure of what you're doing. And I like to have the objective of making something that no one's ever seen before, or maybe to make it a little more modest, something that's uniquely better, that even solves small problems better. So that's a super long answer to a really simple question.
I think there was a lot of different aspects you covered in that answer, and I really like that you captured those essence in it. Carol, so growing from that, you also spoke of, when asked about the personality of your firm, I think you speak about it being guerrilla design is what you came out. So could you, sorry?
Yeah, we've done that.
Yes. So
we call ourselves urban guerrillas, but yeah, I might be overstating it, but it's very romantic.
Essentially, would you be able to speak to how that approach, that personality that kind of formed and associated with Ross Barney Architects, played as a foundation in the growth of your firm? How did that approach play into it?
That's an important thing too, because I don't think there is a right approach. But I do think that if you are an architect who's looking for a job or starting out trying to understand the profession, it's important that you're aware that different firms have different cultures. And having a successful culture is important to the success of the firm. And often they do reflect the personalities of the leaders of the firm, whether it's a partnership or a sole proprietor. So, but there's not one right way. So you have to find the one you're comfortable with. So if you bounce around from job to job for your first few jobs, it's probably not a bad thing. Again, there's not a correct way to do it. And I find that some people really fit into our culture, and some people are uncomfortable with it, not because it's good or bad, because it's moral or ethical, just because it's not the way that they work or think about things. It's not the way they solve problems. But we are, I call it organized chaos. I tell people that I hire talent and I sell ideas. So I really want an atmosphere, a culture that is somewhat uninhibited, where ideas can appear, even, and it may not be a good idea, but you're not criticized. There's no downside to bringing up a legitimate idea. And I also believe I would much rather have someone criticize what I'm saying in my studio or in a charrette than finding out it's wrong later in front of a client. I want to know when I'm wrong, but I also want to see the ideas I missed. So our idea making is pretty free form. I also tell people in my studio that if they're not making ideas, they're not worth what I'm paying them for. I mean, that's the most important commodity to me. Mm-hmm. Now, I've had young architects, even old architects, who aren't comfortable with that. They need more structure. They are most comfortable when their role is defined, and they're more effective that way. This is not a criticism. I understand that people are more effective in certain environments. The other thing that I think, and my partners agree to a large extent, because we've talked about this pretty extensively, is we don't really have anybody who's strictly a manager in the sense of a project manager, someone who does the paper, keeps the job on track. But what we like to do instead, we call them project managers. I'm working for the city of New York now. They want to know who my project manager is. They won't let me get away without having a project manager. But we like to think about them as team leaders instead. That they still have an inline job, something they're very good at, that they love doing, and they are doing that. But because they are leaders, they also are responsible for moving that job forward. And so if you're a project manager in my firm, for example, and you don't like doing paperwork, hopefully you find someone who does, get them on your team and lead them to do that. So we're very unstructured, and it can be, I know it can be frustrating for people, but for me, it's great because it makes us very agile, and it makes us able to react quickly to suggestions and questions and changes. And I look at it and I go, oh, well, that's really crazy, but in a way it's not. I'm the oldest of 8 children. All my life, I've been organizing people, and you probably know, you don't tell your sibs what to do. You have to sort of cajole them and get them to come along. And so this has been my life's role. And it's pretty much true in our firm. I think right now we have about 45 people working in our only studio, which is in Chicago. And I think that for that, probably there's limits to the number of people you could work with in that fashion. So at some point, you probably might have 2 or 3 studios if you're a big firm within a studio, and each one may have a slightly different culture. The basic culture has to align, but their individual cultures may change a little bit. But those are all important to working in a group. And architecture is team sport. Probably today, because there's so much technical information that you have to put into a job, it's probably more important today than it was in the past. You hear these great stories about some great architect leaving a sketch on the draftsman's drawing board, and it was just so beautiful, and that was it. It's not a real practical way to work. Ideas need refinement, and you refine them by examining them and asking the what ifs. So that's how we work. And you go forward and you go backwards. Hopefully you progress more forward than backwards is always good. Another thing that I find really hard about practice is the way that you get paid. Basically you're paid for your time. And sometimes it's not possible to predict how long it'll take you to solve the problem. And so I think architects are always at a little bit of risk that way, because you usually ask, well, how much will you charge me to do this project? What it costs? And it's a reasonable question, but it really is, it's a balancing act when you're running a firm. After you practice a while, you have a pretty good idea how long it'll take. But it's still a tight wire act. It's a balancing act. And all architects, when you're in school, you say, oh my God, it's due in 3 days. What do I do first? How much time do I spend? And I'm sure every architect has had that job explode into nights and rather than just days. It doesn't change when you're in practice. Hopefully you get a little bit better at predicting things, but that's our culture.
So, Carol, my next question in terms of given you work with public spaces and community engagement is something you talk about often, you also highlight the importance of asking people the questions they can answer. I think that really stayed with me. How do you effectively engage with the community to kind of ensure their input shapes the project in meaningful ways? I know you've spoken about it a lot of times, but if you could kind of drain into that a little more.
Oh, no, I'm glad to talk about engagement. When you're in school, most studio professors do start out with the idea that the first thing you do before you even put a pencil to paper is you do research. You find out as much as you can about the site, about the project, about precedents, about prototype. And I think there is less of this now, but in practice, if you look at a standard AIA contract, you're not compensated for that phase. That doesn't appear in any of the writing in a standard AIA contract. But that preparation, this sort of pre-project, pre-design preparation is really, really essential. And one piece of that is talking to the people who are going to use the project, talking to the other stakeholders. And if they're not going to use the project, are they going to pay for the project? And we were really lucky when we were commissioned to do the federal building in Oklahoma City, the one that replaced the Murrah. We had a really good client. It was GSA, but particularly it was an architect. He passed away about 2 or 3 years ago now. His name was Ed Feiner. And he was the chief architect for the General Services Administration. And he was a great leader. He was super innovative. He started the Design Excellence Program that the GSA is still pretty well known for. And they still use that as the selection process and as the design process. But in any case, for Oklahoma, we were selected to do the job. That was good. But as soon as we started on it, the building was going to have a lot of the agencies that were the old building the day it was bombed. And there's some new agencies too, but the old agencies that, we don't really want to move into this building. It has bad memories for us. We're not going to move into this building. And Ed very intelligently told us that we have to talk to them and find out what they need, what they want, ostensibly to make them want to move back to the site. And so he gave us some additional services, of all things, really nice additional services to go and talk to the public, talk to the tenants, talk to the people of Oklahoma City, their elected officials. And that was the first time we had a really structured process to do that. And so we started out, we made it up. Although it wasn't that hard to do. You're pretty good at that as a person. You say, okay, who controls the money? Who controls the opinion? Who's going to actually sit in the chairs? And we used a lot of different techniques we thought really hard about how do we get them to talk to us. If you talk to the mayor, that's one thing. If you talk in a public meeting, like a forum, that's another thing. And you certainly could talk to the department heads and that type of thing about how many chairs do you need, how many employees do you have. The harder part was to get the users, first of all, I identify who is a user and get them to talk. In this case, get them to talk about why they didn't want to go back to the building and what would have to change. And so we did that a couple of ways. We had focus groups. I don't think we called them focus groups. That's a new term. We wrote questionnaires. And I use this example a lot. It sticks in my brain. We wrote a questionnaire about to all the people who would be moving back in. And we asked them what was the most important, and I'm paraphrasing, but what was the most important thing the design had to do? And what came back as the number one answer was there should be no parking near the building. And when you think about it makes total sense. What happened is Timothy McVeigh had went and parked a truck full of race fuel oil, race fuel gasoline, and fertilizer right in front of the building and blew it up. So no parking near the building. And then the second most popular thing that the building had to have was close and convenient parking. And you go, well, wait a minute. How could this be? We must have made a mistake. These were bad questions. They were pretty stupid questions. We're much better now at asking questions than we were then. But actually, that was a really important piece of information that was kind of stumbled on, or it really solidified the idea that this building had to feel very secure and protective. You had to feel that you were safe there, but it also had to be open so it's easy to work there, but open because it was our expression of government too. And we were so impressed. And the other thing is we found out that by talking to these people and reporting back to them what they said and telling them how we were going to use that as a form maker for our design, it changed them from being opponents to being advocates for the job. So we learned those two important questions. And since then, we've tried whenever we can, we try to sell it as a service. We would like to do an engagement. And when we can't sell it as a service, we try to get approval to do it anyway. We've become pretty sophisticated over the time because there are a lot of really interesting techniques to elicit opinion and to elicit valid opinion. And that's what I meant about asking the right question. I think one of the worst questions that you can ask the general public is, what should this building look like? Because their frame of reference is really limited. And if you ask that question, you have to live with the answer. And so you're immediately, because they have limited reference, you're closing down your world of possible answers. So it's important to learn not to ask the wrong questions. That's one example. There are other wrong questions. Anyway, right now, like I said, we love engagements. We have curated a tool test of things that we like to do. We've become more sophisticated as time goes on. There's a lot of sophisticated software programs now that are really helpful. I'm not saying you can do it only by that, but and some of them you see all the time. You have to use them intelligently, but that's okay. And then some things that we've been doing that are absolutely unique, either for the job or they're not manufactured, they're not engineered software programs. We have certain games we like to play, and some of them work and some of them don't work at all. One that does work really well is you get to be the architect and you produce the program in some usable form, either blocks of space or whatever. And individual people who are important to understanding what we're doing get to design their own building. Now, you can't ask them to design a building because, our language is drawing. A lot of people don't draw. So you try to make a tool that they could use to express their ideas, but also to give them a sense of how complex the challenge that they're faced with and that they've asked us to do with them is. And so it's been really interesting. the other thing that made it super complicated, but in a way was a step forward, is the pandemic made everything really, really complicated. Because before you'd sit down, you'd meet with people. And then during the pandemic, we were doing engagement where we never met the community. It was all over Zoom. I think that, and it was so successful in a way, because in a Zoom meeting, anybody can take the floor. Problems. But in any case, and that's become pretty sophisticated now. We're trying to drive it back to in-person meetings, though, because we think that there are some things that happen in person you just can't replicate virtually.
You speak about designers need to be optimistic. Like you have to be an optimistic person to be a designer.
Absolutely.
Talking to the conference this year, I think we did a little series called Blueprints and Banter, where we got certain architects there and explored certain questions with them. One of them was, what is an reaffirmation? What is an affirmation you remind yourself of? What is a new habit you want to form? And they all tend to think about Arthur Brooks' keynote. And they got a little pensive in terms of finding work-life balance, finding sort of happiness in what I'm doing. And the affirmation, they said, is that believe that you can do it. So I felt like the optimism was somewhere lost, and we're trying to kind of find a way through it. And you being, at the core of it, you ooze optimism to me, Carol. So essentially, through the next questions, I want to try and explore that, especially maybe in terms of when there's adversity. We all know your projects in terms of Chicago Riverwalk and the work you've done with the federal building. But additionally, you've also partnered with corporate partners like McDonald's flagship store. You also talk about working with the Chicago police station at the moment. What I'm trying to bring is that you've managed to bring traditionally opposing stakeholders to the table. And in a society where we're living right now, which is fairly polarized and there's just confirmation bias, you kind of are an advocate of opening these channels of conversation and creating equity through design, through what you talk about is creating consensus. Could you speak to that when you say creating consensus? You make a segregation as to what you mean by that and what you don't. If you could elaborate a little on that.
Yeah, I can. These are all linked ideas. The idea that, I guess, I believe that design needs to be innovative. I think that change is the basic condition of humanity, and without change, that we will fail, that we'll get worse. So I start out at that level, and those are really personal beliefs. But then I also realized that I have to do that, to make change. You have to build consensus. So the important thing then is to sort of identify these really basic virtues or basic objectives so that you can agree with people. And it's not that I can do this better than anyone else, because I think that, and I'm going to sound like a pessimist, I'm really disturbed by the condition of politics these days. I really do. I see common goals for us, but there's so much in the way that is distracting. It's really hard to get on that path. Like, I think if you got even the most divisive group of people in a room, they would agree about what they want to accomplish for themselves and for their neighbors. And in most cases, it has to do with a quality of life and a sense of security. And so you get that level of, but then, you start diverting from that. And maybe people take branches off too soon. But that type of thing, I was sitting on a plane the other day, and the couple next to me who didn't know each other started talking about how terrible Biden was and all these terrible immigrants that are in their communities. Turned out, I guess, listening to no migrants really even lived near them, but they knew they were there. But these quick diversions from the real things, we want to have a quality of life for everyone, and we want to feel safe and secure. And you take these paths off so soon that you get into a real mess? I don't know what the answer to that is. However, I'm often in the situation where I get to be at the front of the room, at least about designs. So I find it really useful to go back to those really commonly held principles and to tell people that for this day, at least, we're all going to be optimists, so we can solve it. Do they leave the room that way? I don't know, probably not. But often that gives a project enough support that you can make change. The other thing that I just realized myself, I talk a lot about sustainability. And then I realized that some of the stuff we do is so minuscule. Like, okay, so you change the structure of a building from steel to wood and you save so many tons of carbon. Is that going to save the planet? Does that matter? It's a drop in the bucket, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the important thing back then is to stand back and realize it's a drop in a bucket and start making as many drops as you possibly can. So, I mean, I think it's just, being able to zoom in and zoom out to get people to see themselves in the picture. That'll make them optimists, and hopefully it'll build consensus. I think it's really hard to do today. I think it's a super challenge, which is why architects need to be optimists.
Yeah. So, Carol, I think something interesting that you even talk about when you talk about parallels, you say that corporates are much like cities, just lesser people, is the parallel you draw, and probably how you negotiated. That's my guess, working with McDonald's. How does that conversation like now, Carol? Like when you took up the project from Chicago Police Station, you also talk about getting sort of your team, your people at work refuse. And I see where they're coming from. What does that conversation look like to get them on page? Like how you say, I see where you're coming from, and it's only at this stage that I see where you're going with this. But what did that look like when they approached you, when you had to convince your team to come and play it? And what was your vision for it?
Yeah. That was real interesting. The reason, okay, so we were asked to do this job for the police. It's a lot of really hard work in a way. It's not terribly glamorous. One of my partners, Krista Stuyvesant-Kleiva, is the daughter of a policeman. She's always been really sensitive to the idea of police and community. And she's from a smaller city, not Chicago, but she had a real understanding of what the idea of policing could be. Community policing, policing that wasn't controversial. Mm-hmm. And so that was her background. So she was really anxious to do this job. And like I said, I think people should do stuff they want to do. So I was on her side. And as a group, we decided we would accept this commission. And I was really I knew that those types of things had been controversial for some architects, particularly recently. AI New York had a big discussion a couple years ago, maybe as many as 3 years ago now, where there was a group of AI New York members who wanted to make a requirement that members don't do any law enforcement. Architects, basically, AA members won't do any law enforcement. And it was really controversial. And I had that in the back of my mind. I knew that, but I never really thought about my studio. Would they object? Because we always seemed like such a together group, and I thought I knew what they were thinking. It turns out I had no idea what they were thinking. And there was a very thoughtful and opinionated group that we shouldn't do this. That this is that the history of law enforcement in our society is terrible, and that we shouldn't work on projects that continue that history. And so for us, I just told you the way we work. that's a terrible thing, because we have to, it's important that we agree and that we feel comfortable working with each other. So you can be open. I told you our design process, you have to trust the people, or you have to trust people that you can have an opinion. Anyway, so we sat down, we talked about it, and in a way, we almost took the engagement methodology that we use for our clients and applied it to ourselves. So it started out a series of get-togethers. It was made clear that everybody was invited. Attendance was not required, but anybody could come, and there was no foregone conclusion about what we were going to be doing. And the other thing was that we told them is that we were really interested in understanding how people think. That we weren't voting on whether we would do the job or not. We told them that every idea was welcome. We told them if they didn't want to work on the job, should we accept it, that they didn't need to, that we would make that accommodation since this seemed to be so heartfelt. And so it started out pretty fiery. The people with the strongest opinions. I have one very, very smart architect. In fact, he's a bit of a wonky guy. He, in addition to being a very good architect, he knows every baseball statistic, I think. So he's very thoughtful. He reads a lot. And so he was the first one to speak, and he was really prepared. And the stuff he said, a lot of people hadn't heard before, and it was compelling. And then on the other side of the spectrum was my partner, who I told you about, and she talked about it from a totally different perspective. And there were no conclusions. There was discussion, and we held probably maybe 3 or 4 of them. And what developed was exactly the type of support and consensus that I talked about wanting for my projects, to the point where people could say, well, I still can't work on this project, but I can see why maybe our studio should. And so that's how we solved it. The interesting sort of story was, I was so interested in this. I taught this in 5th year last year. So at IIT, we have a lottery where I get up and I say, I want to teach. So I got up and I said, I want to teach you how to design a police station. And I told them that if they could even join the studio, if they wanted to abolish the police, but they'd have to design some other system. But, they'd have to do that. And they turned out beautiful work. Some of them did abolish the police. And the thoughtfulness of the answers was really impressive.
Okay. Right, Carol. And the next bit, I think you always, in your own way, are always pushing boundaries. I mean, today, yes, you have won. You are the AI National Gold Medal winner, which is a tremendous honor. But what really stayed with me in that talk is you talk about style being sort of an antithesis to design, and the fact that you don't believe, while one would argue that in the industry where architects are often encouraged to develop a style, and many renowned architects are known for distinct styles, you come from a very different school of thought, and that would have got its own fair share of criticism when you were on it, right? And today you stand here having won the award. What I'm trying to ask is, where did that belief come from? I mean, usually when people, suppose their goal is as an architect to win this ultimate award, you kind of work towards a template that you've seen works. You develop a style, you get these many projects, but you went an opposite direction.
Yeah.
Which could have very well not ended in an award. The fact that it did just validates maybe what you...
I hope so.
Yeah. How did you find that sort of strength and the belief against that wave, Carol?
I think that's the way we're moving, if you want to know the truth. I think I was ahead of the curve. If you look at the history of particularly the last centuries, we're moving towards, and it said fits and starts. You can say to me, well, hey, but look at Palestine today or something like that. Look at Israel. Look at Kenya yesterday with the riots, that kind of stuff. There's no denying that we're moving to a more egalitarian society. The most powerful economies are the ones that are democracies. Yeah, they're social democracies. They're capitalistic. You're rewarded for your production, but the idea that people are that they have voices in their existence is definitely the way that people are moving, and that we're successful. That doesn't mean that it's going to happen overnight, though. And the corollary, though, is that that's true about style, architectural style, too. I mean, in a way, when you talk only about style, that's the easiest thing to discuss. That's the least number of voices. You know, it's like the level you scratch. It's lazy when you do that. And I can say that today. But I can't tell you that it always didn't bother me. When I was a much younger architect, I was criticized often because they'd say, "Oh, what are you doing, Carol? Every building looks different. You know, why don't you do something right? Keep with it." And I realized after a while that I didn't agree with the idea of what was right. I didn't think that. I really respect and learn a lot from great architects of the past. It was disturbing to me that they were always connected with something you could identify the way they look. One of the projects that got me thinking about this early on, we had to remodel Carol Schurz High School here in Chicago. You may not know the job, but it was built, I want to say it's about 1900. The architect was Dwight Perkins, who was the original. He is the Perkins from Perkins and Will, the original. And he was the architect for the Chicago School Board when this design was done. And at that point, they were designing in-house. So he was the designer of the building too. And it's a very famous building of Prairie School origin. You know, there's scholarly stuff written about it all the time. Always writing about the appearance of it, you know, how it's Prairie School, the appearance of the brick, the selection of color, the overhanging eaves, the materiality. Actually, when you read about what Perkins thought about it, though, there were ideas that were much more about life quality and using the building. For example, he put the cafeteria on the top floor because Chicago was so polluted in those days. There's a lot of, we were burning coal to keep warm. That was where you had the cleanest air. So he thought that that's where you should have lunch. Now they eventually blew the lunch down, but you could see the things that made him think were not just what it looked like. He also put big skylights on top of the stairwells, which now sounds like a terrible idea because no code will let you do that because of the fire codes. And he left them open so people could easily, move through the building, and it would be daylit. And so I just think that sometimes we analyze the simplest of form givers rather than the ones that are really important. And some architects do both. They do. They have a style, but they also do these brilliant, innovative designs that make living easier and better and more rewarding. I, though, have a long time ago have felt that it's coming back to the idea that, yeah, I can think of 2 or 3 or 4 ways that I would do an answer to a problem that I would be really proud of. And so, I guess as time went on, I became more obstinate about it. And now I really think that if it's buildable, if it's affordable, if it does its job really well, and by that really well, I mean flexible for the future also, and that it's sustainable, 9 times out of 10, if you do that, you can make it beautiful also. It'll make a style that is very serene, beautiful. I think if you integrate those things, for one thing, I think my other theory is that buildings that have the least number of moving parts are the best ones. Like if you propose a solution that creates a problem, if it doesn't have that continuity, that integration, that you really aren't. It's not as good as it could be. So, I worry about the way things look, but I try to derive it out of the other pieces that have been given to me to solve, rather than my idea of what's beautiful. I'm not sure I even have an idea of that anymore. I know it when I see it, but it's very integrated.
And just the last question, Carol, kind of ties into what you identify your gift as a storyteller. My question is, how do you kind of envision the role of architects evolving in the next 20 years? Why I ask that is, it boils down to us living in a society that is becoming more and more polarized. Credit to social media, we could argue the pros and cons of it. I think we are very lucky to have a storyteller like you on our side. But how do you envision the role of architects changing within that sphere, and storytelling being a powerful tool within that? It's something I see you're gifted with. Is that something you think you can develop as an architect? Is that something you need to work on? How does one go about it?
I think that we're probably all natural storytellers, but I think that the role that it plays in design probably needs to be emphasized. And that doesn't mean that you should be some good old boy telling a lot of jokes at the front of the room. That's not it either. I think maybe another way to describe it is connecting. That, if you tell your story, the understanding that you build connects you to people. They tell you things that they need to tell you. I think that everybody does it. I think some people are more comfortable than others, but I don't think everybody understands how important it is to making design. And maybe that's the thing we need to teach, is how important it is. There's no excuse to go into any situation, discussion, presentation, meeting with bad information. And we need to be rigorous. I would really feel bad if someone took my interest in storytelling to mean that the solution doesn't need to be rigorous and vetted. And I mean, in a way, we're responsible for more information and more technology than we ever have. And you can't excuse yourself from knowing that stuff. But sometimes we tell that to people rather than what the really important things that they need to consider to make decisions are. And so I'm not trying to grow a bunch of, knee-slapping good old boys story around the campfire. But I do think that discussions about design, about problem solving, have to start with values. And that's where the stories come in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're just creating an equitable society through design, Carol. I think you do it through your conversations, through these
Exactly.
Thank you so much for finding the time to have this conversation.
Well, I enjoyed it too. I hadn't really even planned to spend this much time, so you really got me. No, I've had a good time.
Thank you so much, Carol.